I'm so excited to be here. My name is Kheperah, and it means divine transformation. Erica sends her apologies for not being here. I'm so honored to talk to you today about reducing violence in the city. And here I go. Erica Ford is the founder of Life Camp, one of the leading violence intervention and prevention organizations in the country and based in South Jamaica, Queens, New York. I'm here on her behalf to talk about reducing violence in the city and how, with Erica Ford's vision and leadership, we have helped to make New York City one of the safest cities in America last year. But before I can tell you how that happened, I have to give you context on how that was inspired so you understand the methods that she took. Erica grew up in South Jamaica, Queens, where a lot of her friends died or were killed during the crack epidemic, or they went to jail for what we call football numbers, double digits. And so needless to say, these men left women and children behind. The families were completely destroyed. The women were angry. The children were afraid. And she watched them as they began to lose hope. And to prevent them from getting caught up in the street life and seeing her community further destroyed, Erica made a decision to quit her job and dedicate her life to being the change in her community. And so she started Life Camp. But the goal of Life Camp was to develop youth leaders and provide positive alternatives to violence and antisocial behavior. And she also wanted to provide services to address the mental, physical, and emotional wellness needs of the parents and families who were impacted by the trauma of gun violence. But in order to do that as a nonprofit organization, she knew she had to build partnerships between the community stakeholders who were really dedicated to shifting the culture of violence in the community. So for decades, Erica worked from the ground level. She developed partnerships with local precincts, with clergy, with schools, with law enforcement, local influencers in the public-private sector, and most importantly, folks at the street level, to galvanize all the resources needed to satisfy the mission of Life Camp. And so over time, she developed this violence intervention and prevention system, VIPs. And they would interrupt violence before it happened or stop retaliations so that the disease of violence would not continue to spread. She got together with community influencers and experts and fine-tuned this VIP system and then took it to the city council and the mayor's office because she wanted to create a system that was citywide. She realized that in order to make this effective, it wasn't enough to make change in her community. She realized that the children got on the train and went to school in other boroughs, the parents went to work in other boroughs in the cities, and they carried with them the trauma of violence, which was often triggered by stressors at school or stressors in the work environment, which would perpetuate other problems. So with a lot of hard work, a lot of effort, and with many years of struggle, in 2014, Erica Ford co-created the New York City Crisis Management System with the New York City Council and the Mayor's Office. So this system operates across 5 boroughs of New York City, and it is concentrated in the neighborhoods that make up about 50% of all the shootings in New York. The initiative started with an investment from the mayor of $12 million across 17 sites, and today the investment has expanded to a $28 million investment across 24 sites with 60 community-based organizations involved and 10 city agencies, and they all come together to co-produce public safety. I need to just take a moment because that's a huge deal, and I really need to break down how this works. And I'm gonna put my notes down. So I was cheating. I like to be transparent. We lost a team member, and because of that, Erica was not able to be here. So she was like, "Tag, you're it." And then when I spoke to this gentleman, he was like, "I gotta make sure you're talking about, reducing violence in the city. I know she tagged you in, and it was the last minute." So what I did was I talked my notes, just for you all who are public speakers, and I was listening to them through my earbud, and I was talking. That's why I may have seemed a little not animated. So now I'm gonna flow from here, if that's okay. I just wanted to make sure I got all the key talking points because that's important, And so the New York City crisis management system, understand we come from a big city. And someone spoke yesterday about how tough it is in the city. So Erica Ford has also been impacted by gun violence, and so have I. I'm a native of Brooklyn, New York. Erica lost her father. He was killed in the Vietnam War, and even though her mother was given a Purple Heart for her father's service, nothing could really replace the broken heart. Nothing could replace the pain. And then growing up in the 80s and seeing the crack epidemic and people being killed in the street, Erica was traumatized. And so when she first went to the city council, if you know Erica Ford, and Google her if you don't, she was kicking in the door. She was angry. Deepak Chopra called her the angry peacemaker because she would get in a politician's face and say, "You better do this. Our people are dying." And even though her message was pure and honest, it was mired in trauma. And city council doesn't speak the language of trauma. So they didn't hear her. And so for many, many years, she struggled as a traumatized person on the front lines of trauma. And many people in our community want to serve, but they're serving wounded, right? We're wounded healers. And so where I came in, I met Erica. I worked in the music industry for 10 years in the 90s during the golden era of hip hop and R&B. And I had a spiritual transformation, and Spirit led me to leave, to actually break my employment contract and walk away from what seemed like a lot to go and transform the minds of young people, because I saw how they were impacted by the influence of the music and the messaging. And one of my favorite verses that inspired that was, "Be ye not conformed of this world, but be ye also transformed by the renewing of your mind." And so I created an organization called Gemnasium, where we mine the diamond mine, where we teach people how to identify the mental and emotional blockages that hold them back. And so in doing this work, I met Erica. And we began to work together, and she was so angry because imagine the impact of trauma. And I had been studying the brain and the impact of trauma on the brain and how it actually activates the autonomic nervous system. And so trauma can stay in the tissues for years. And they say 65% of black and brown people have a lifetime of trauma. And so what would happen is that you're always in that fight or flight response. So when she would go to the city council, because kids were being shot in the street, people were dying, families were being torn apart, and she was living in the community, when they would say no or they were cold, she would pop off. That autonomic nervous system would kick in, that reptilian brain would, "What do you mean? You don't understand." And when I tell you she gave it to anybody, politicians, respectfully sometimes clergy, school officials, NYPD, she was the angry peacemaker, right? And many of you know a lot of activists who have a great message, but they're angry. When you live in a big city like New York, you have to come in with compassion. You have to learn how to flow and get through that system. To accomplish a crisis management system with a close to $30 million budget is major. And that's why I had to take a moment to really let that sink in. This little girl from South Jamaica, Queens, in the big city. So let me tell you how this system works. Through the crisis management system, we employ what are called credible messengers. Because you see, what happens is when young people get into a fight, and sometimes what happens is if a kid gets in a fight in school, maybe after school, someone comes with a gun, it turns into a bigger problem. So we have employed, in the New York City crisis management system, more than 5,000 credible messengers. These are people who are formerly incarcerated, who have turned their lives around, who have gone through training, and have been committed to making peace in the community. And so now they are on the front lines of preventing violence. And they're considered like the OGs. The young people listen to them, right? They're not gonna listen to me and you. Well, they might listen to me, but they're not gonna listen to you, right? So they're able to penetrate the community and go sometimes in places where the police can't. But keep in mind, we work with the NYPD. So what happens is if they know, for example, that something is happening in what we call our catchment area, they might notify us. So we have a chance to kind of settle things before it gets out of hand and a young person gets processed through the system. We also work with all the alphabets, the DOE, the Department of Education. We work with school safety. So if there's a fight in the school, school safety will contact us or one of the Cure violent sites throughout New York City and say, hey, listen, some of your kids are in a fight. We send our teams there. Sometimes they're in the school during the day or after school during those critical times, and they can squash a beef and prevent things from getting any further. And anybody that knows anything about young people in school know a lot of times things happen through social media. Small things become big things, and then people want to prove themselves. Now young people are using machetes. You know, it's really gotten out of hand. So our credible messengers often stop beefs and violence before it happens. We also work with the DOHMH, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. They provide funding so that we can implement unconventional therapeutic services. Because understand this, a young person who has experienced a lifetime of trauma, you know, they used to say that PTSD was caused by one major traumatic incident. But now studies show that cumulative stress creates PTSD. And studies show that 33% of black and brown people, 1 out of 3, suffer from PTSD. The stress of poverty, the stress of paying bills, being a single parent, the worry for the safety of their children when they live in communities impacted by violence, the stress for a young person of not maybe graduating, or the fear of walking to school and maybe being jumped in by a gang. All of those things are stressful. And you turn on the news, and at one point every other week, a black or brown person was being killed by a police officer. That is cumulative stress. So now you take a young person who's gone into the school and maybe they didn't have breakfast and maybe they don't have the right sneakers, or, you know, maybe they're dealing with all types of stress. And so there's no support for that. There's no compassion for that. There's judgment. I was intrigued when I heard someone speaking yesterday talking about why you need to go into the cities and how, you know, if someone came to the church, they would say, no, your church is there. And I couldn't understand that because, you know, what I learned was that the Spirit of God is omnipotent, omniscient. It is everywhere, ever present, and all powerful. So when we judge others, when we look at criminalizing black and brown people, and I'm speaking about that community because that's the community that I serve, but when you look at a shooting, a mass shooting in a high school, the victims are humanized. You know their stories, you know they have dogs, pets, you know their hobbies, you know their grades, you know their families, you hear from their siblings. Many times in black and brown communities when there's a shooting, even when it's a wrongful shooting of an unarmed person, you hear about their criminal history, or they stole some candy when they were 5 years old, or they failed their math class, or they came from a broken home. You hear all these things, and that criminalizes them in our minds. And that keeps us from having compassion. And then we don't see each other as our sisters and brothers. We forget that we are one. We begin to look from this ego place of separation. And so the New York City Crisis Management System created these wraparound services because what Erica realized was it wasn't enough to just intervene a beef. It wasn't just enough to stop a fight. What do you do with that young person once you have them? I believe you said yesterday, these kids were vandalizing your church because they were bored. Right? So when you destroy all of the resources, well, I don't want to say destroy, but when you diminish school programs, when you diminish community programs, sometimes that's what happens. So she knew we had to have wraparound services. So these 10 city agencies help us to provide wraparound services. We also work with legal aid. Sometimes a young person gets in a little bit of trouble and they just need a lawyer. I don't know if many of you know the story of this young man who was alleged to have stolen an iPhone, and he didn't have the $1,500 bail, so he was remanded to Rikers Island, one of the worst prisons in New York City. And because he didn't have bail, he ended up languishing in the system for 3 years. And he ended up committing suicide when he was finally released. And it turned out it was a mistaken identity. He wasn't even the person. This happens to black and brown people all the time. And so we provide legal aid so that those things don't happen before a young person gets processed and goes through the system. Because you know, once you get processed, right, you get fingerprinted, you get your mug shot, you get a rap sheet. Right? And so then when you go for employment, even if you've committed a crime and time is never served in certain communities. And so it's an act of violence when you prevent me from getting gainful employment after I've served my time in this horrible place, and now I'm trying to get my life together. And you go, well, have you ever committed a crime? Because Martha Stewart can get a new business and a show with Snoop Dogg, but you cannot. right? And so where does that person go? So again, that's a lack of compassion. There is no you versus me. We are one. They say if you split an atom and you put it on two sides of the world, if you manipulate that half of the atom, the other half is going to be impacted. There is no way that violence is not a disease that impacts all of us. So we work to change the narrative of how violence is addressed. And so we are working to actually introduce new language and change the public opinion to really make violence a public health issue. So we've been working with the Department of Health. And imagine if you are in a traumatized community, you are someone who is a high-risk shooter, someone who has the potential to shoot, and be clear, just because you are a high-risk shooter doesn't mean that you're a criminal. You could have been someone who's bullied and who's afraid and who ends up getting a gun because you're afraid for your life, right? But imagine if you could get a prescription for yoga. Imagine if you can get a prescription that would be paid for through Medicaid where you can get therapeutic services. So we bring alternative therapeutic services to the hood. And Erica is my hero. She's a rock star because she got Deepak Chopra to come to the hood and teach yoga and meditation. She took 4 young men whose parents, believe it or not, were celebrated on rap records back in the 90s for being big-time drug dealers and criminals. And so they are either dead or in jail. And she saw that these young people were going down that path, and they were like local celebrities, you know, young people with all the swag. You know what swag is, right? If I just say it like that, you get the context, right? It just means, you know, you fly. So she got these kids who thought yoga was gay, yoga wasn't masculine, and she got Deepak Chopra, brought him to South Jamaica, Queens, and they were like, Tupac's coming? No, Deepak's coming. They didn't even know who he was, which was great for him, right? We kind of gave him street cred. So he began to work with these young people and brought him in his yogi, Eddie Stern, who's a yogi to the stars, and we developed a program called the Urban Yogis. And now these young people are yoga instructors, certified, and they get paid to teach yoga in schools, and they go into the projects in the summertime, in the middle of the projects, and they do yoga. And so sometimes the kids will post like, I'm downward dogging, but I'm still strapped, son. You know what I mean? Because they still want to make it cool. But what we did is change the narrative, right? Because in the beginning was the word, and the word is good, right? And the word is of God. And so by changing the word, by changing the narrative of how we approach violence, we actually help to heal, making yoga cool. Erica also created something called New York Peace Week because we have to create events and parties. You know, I come from the music industry as well, so marketing and branding to young people is important. How we communicate the message is important. Sometimes we have to look the part, you know, in order for them to respect and relate to us. And so we created something called New York Peace Week, and it starts during the week of Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, so it runs from January 15th to the 22nd. We work with the schools, the churches, we work with civic organizations, and we encourage people to implement programming that inspires people to take personal responsibility for making peace a lifestyle. It could be something as simple as no road rage this week, no gossiping at the office, do your chores, do your homework, make your mother happy. You know what I'm saying? Just simple things that you can do to take personal responsibility for creating peace. Well, after 5 years, effective last year, New York Peace Week is an official event on the New York City calendar. So where you'll have New York Fashion Week and New York Fleet Week, you will have New York Peace Week. So that's another major accomplishment. So again, how we reduce violence in our city is we galvanize all of these major organizations. We create narrative and language to create cool events and shift the idea of how we approach violence. We're working to create legislation and change public opinion to make violence a public health issue. And of course, the most important thing is leading with compassion, seeing each other as our brothers and sisters, understanding that we are all connected and that we cannot do it alone. Thank you.